Amelia Thompson had always loved flying, though not from the cockpit. To her, airplanes were like massive birds gliding effortlessly above the clouds, carrying people to new stories, new lives, new adventures. Today, she was just another passenger aboard Flight 462, heading from Denver to New York. She sat by the window, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, doodling clouds in the golden light of the afternoon sun. Around her, families chatted, business people tapped on laptops, and children pressed their faces to the windows in awe. Amelia, however, seemed almost invisible, a quiet figure lost in her own world. She wasn't nervous about flying. Not really. Amelia had studied planes extensively. Her fascination had begun as a child, when her father, a former Air Force engineer, would tell her stories about aircraft and flight simulations. Over the years, she had spent countless hours learning about aircraft controls, engine systems, and emergency procedures, not because she intended to be a pilot, but simply because she loved knowing how things worked. That knowledge, which had seemed like an innocent hobby, would soon become something far more important. The plane climbed smoothly, sunlight reflecting off its sleek fuselage. The hum of the engines was steady. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Everything seemed ordinary, but suddenly, without warning, a jolt ran through the cabin. Drinks spilled, a few passengers let out startled gasps, and the seatbelt sign blinked aggressively. Amelia felt a small twinge of concern, not fear but curiosity. The plane's movement didn't feel like ordinary turbulence. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a mechanical issue. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Amelia's heart rate quickened, not with panic, but with focus. Something about the tone of the announcement told her that this was serious. She noticed subtle shifts in the plane's trajectory, slight vibrations she had read about in manuals. This was more than turbulence. The aircraft was signaling distress. Passengers glanced around nervously. Some whispered anxiously, while others tried to comfort children. Flight attendants moved quickly, calming those around them. Amelia, however, remained unusually calm. She had a strange, unshakable instinct that something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would require her knowledge, her attention, and perhaps even her courage. As the plane leveled off at 35,000 feet, she closed her sketchbook, tucked it carefully under her arm, and looked toward the cockpit. No one suspected that the quiet, ordinary passenger sitting by the window might soon become the most important person on the flight. The calm of the flight shattered within moments. A loud bang echoed from the engines, followed by a shrill alarm that pierced the cabin. The plane lurched violently, sending passengers sliding across their seats. Drinks and trays tumbled to the floor. Screams erupted as fear swept through the cabin like wildfire. Amelia gripped the armrests, her mind racing, not with panic, but with calculations. She knew instinctively that this was no ordinary malfunction. Over the intercom, the co-pilot's voice trembled. This is not a drill. We have an engine failure and I need assistance." Then there was silence, followed by a thud, the unmistakable sound of the captain collapsing. A collective gasp ran through the cabin. Flight attendants froze mid-step, some clutching the overhead compartments for support. Passengers stared wide-eyed at the cockpit door, their minds struggling to comprehend what was happening. Amelia's focus sharpened. She had studied emergency scenarios countless times, but never imagined she would face one in real life. Yet something deep inside her knew exactly what to do. She stood quickly, steadying herself against the swaying aisle, and moved toward the cockpit. Murmurs of confusion and disbelief followed her. "Who is she?"
"A passenger!"
Some whispered. Others stared, their faces pale with fear. When Amelia reached the cockpit, the scene was worse than she had imagined. The captain slumped unconscious over the controls, breathing shallowly. The co-pilot, pale and shaking, barely kept a hand on the yoke. Red warning lights flashed incessantly across the panels. Outside, the plane pitched against gusting winds, clouds churning ominously around the engines. I can't handle this," the co-pilot stammered, backing away slightly. His hands trembled in fear, unable to make the critical adjustments the plane demanded. Amelia took a deep breath, her voice steady but firm. You can't, but I can help. Step aside. She strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat, her hands already hovering over the controls. Her fingers moved with precision, guided by years of knowledge and an instinctive understanding of the plane's mechanics. The cockpit was tense, silent except for the blaring alarms and the roar of the engines struggling outside. Amelia's calm presence seemed almost surreal to the crew watching her. She quickly assessed the instruments, adjusted the flaps, and stabilized the plane. The sudden jerks lessened slightly. Outside, the storm raged, but Amelia's mind was clear. She spoke into the radio with authority, contacting air traffic control, giving precise coordinates and requests. Each instruction she received was calculated and executed flawlessly. Every passenger, flight attendant, and crew member in the cabin felt it. The presence of someone extraordinary, an ordinary passenger rising to meet an unimaginable moment. Amelia knew the hardest part was yet to come. Landing a damaged plane would require not just skill, but nerves of steel, and she would have to summon every ounce of both. The plane groaned under the strain of damaged engines, lurching as Amelia's hands worked quickly over the controls. Every adjustment required precision, every decision had consequences. She could feel the weight of the passengers' lives pressing down on her. Yet strangely, she felt calm, a quiet focus that cut through the chaos. The storm outside raged with relentless fury. Thunder cracked like exploding drums, and lightning illuminated the cabin in harsh, fleeting flashes. Rain lashed against the windows, and the plane rocked violently. Amelia's mind raced through every emergency procedure she had memorized, recalling countless flight simulations. Every scenario she had studied became real. Every tiny skill she had honed was tested in an instant. "Amelia Thompson?" the co-pilot finally asked, awe and disbelief in his voice. How are you doing this?" She didn't answer. Words would have slowed her. Her eyes stayed fixed on the instruments, her fingers dancing across the controls, adjusting throttle, flaps, and stabilizers with precision. Slowly, she managed to level the aircraft, reducing the erratic pitching that had terrified the passengers just moments ago. In the cabin, people whispered in shock and relief. Flight attendants moved cautiously through the aisles, reassuring passengers while stealing glances toward the cockpit. Some had tears in their eyes, unable to believe that a young passenger had taken control in a moment of life-and-death crisis. Parents held their children close. Business people, usually rigid and composed, slumped in their seats, trembling with gratitude and fear. Amelia's mind shifted to the next challenge: landing. She contacted air traffic control, her voice calm but authoritative. "Flight 462, this is Amelia Thompson. We have a partial engine failure and require an emergency landing, requesting immediate clearance." "Copy that, Flight 462, the controller responded. "Runway 27 cleared. Emergency crews are on standby." The descent began. The plane shuddered violently as Amelia adjusted the flaps and throttles, compensating for unstable engines. The ground rushed closer with terrifying speed, and turbulence battered the fuselage, threatening to throw the aircraft off course. But Amelia remained focused. She visualized the landing strip, imagined the plane's weight and balance, and guided it with meticulous care. Finally, the runway came into view, rain slicked and gleaming under the stormy skies. Amelia aligned the plane, holding her breath as she calculated the final approach. The tires touched down with a screech that seemed impossibly loud. The plane bounced once, twice, but she held the yoke steady. Slowly, carefully, she guided it to a full stop. A tense silence filled the cabin before it erupted into cheers. Amelia exhaled, exhausted but unbroken. Her hands trembled slightly, but she smiled faintly. Knowing she had done what no one thought possible, she had taken control, flown a plane through disaster, and saved everyone aboard Flight 462. The plane came to a complete stop, tires screeching against the wet tarmac. Emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 462, their flashing lights reflecting in the rain-soaked windows. Inside, passengers were still trembling, gripping their seats or holding hands, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Amelia unstrapped herself from the co-pilot's seat, her hands slightly shaking, though her face remained composed. The co-pilot, who had been frozen in shock moments before, finally spoke. I don't know what to say. You saved all our lives. Amelia shook her head, brushing off the praise. Just glad everyone's safe, she said softly, her voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She stepped out of the cockpit into the cabin, where passengers were staring at her in disbelief and awe. Children peered at her wide-eyed, whispering to their parents. She was just a passenger. Adults nodded, their expressions a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and respect. Flight attendants approached cautiously, unsure how to respond to someone who had taken over in a moment of life-and-death crisis. Soon, news crews arrived, their cameras trained on the heroic figure who had defied expectation. Reporters jostled for a glimpse, their microphones thrust toward her face. Amelia smiled faintly, shrugging. I just did what had to be done, she repeated, humble despite the accolades. Inside the terminal, stories began to spread like wildfire. Passengers shared their first-hand accounts on social media, describing how an ordinary woman had transformed into a hero before their very eyes. Hashtags like #passenger_hero and Flight 462 went viral, and soon, news channels were broadcasting her calm, decisive actions to millions of viewers. Later, the airline held a press conference. The pilot, still recovering from the shock, stood beside Amelia. They spoke of her courage, her knowledge, and her composure under pressure. She wasn't just a passenger, the captain said, his voice thick with emotion. She was a guardian angel in the cockpit. Amelia remained humble, refusing to claim credit. But she knew one thing. Ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could rise to heights they never imagined. A quiet passenger, once lost in the background of 100 others, had flown a plane through disaster and emerged as a hero. As she finally walked away from the airport that evening, Amelia glanced back at the aircraft, now safely resting on the tarmac. A small smile curved her lips. She had stepped into the cockpit not for fame, not for glory, but because she had no choice, and because courage often comes quietly, in moments no one expects. And in the hearts of everyone aboard Flight 462, her name would forever be remembered as the passenger who flew a plane when it mattered most.